When two governments quit speaking directly, communication doesn't end. It just moves to different channels. A carefully timed anniversary letter, a funeral delegation, a warship parked somewhere it technically shouldn't be, none of it accidental, and none of it really about the surface-level reason given, and 4 storylines make this clear right now. This week saw the most senior Russian official to set foot in Tehran since the war there ended, and the funeral wasn't the whole reason for the trip. In public, he stood in for Moscow at the burial of a man killed by an airstrike, a gesture that itself signals Russia isn't stepping back from Tehran, while behind the scenes his real job is overseeing Russia's defense manufacturing output, and around the same time his visit was arranged, sources close to Russia's security apparatus quietly circulated oddly precise details about advanced jet production for Iran, completed aircraft, a delivery timeframe, a total order size, with the timing lining up too precisely with the trip to be a genuine leak rather than deliberate signaling, made more significant by the fact that Iran's new supreme leader's health, whereabouts, and even the accuracy of the official narrative around him remain unclear. So, a high-ranking Russian visitor gaining access into that vacuum isn't trivial, and the real signal will show up in the weeks that follow, not this week's headlines. Around Belarus's independence anniversary, Moscow sent a letter that read like standard diplomatic filler on the surface, but buried in it was the phrase cooperation to counter external threats and challenges, which is carrying real weight given 2 specific threats. Ukraine has been pressuring Belarus directly to dismantle infrastructure allegedly used to coordinate drone strikes, stop shipping oil products to Russia, and even cut economic ties with Moscow altogether. An ask Minsk answered by doing the opposite, publicly rejecting the pressure, then quickly meeting Russian officials to reaffirm alignment. While separately, the 2 heads of state reportedly held a 2-day summit at a residence Russia has previously claimed was targeted in a drone assassination attempt, a length of time that points to real military negotiation rather than a photo op, meaning the anniversary letter's talk of fruitful cooperation is a public marker laid down after a private deal. Sources outside Russia with a solid track record put roughly 45,000 Russian troops currently spread across Belarusian territory in training missions and infrastructure hardening work, while Belarus's own army, long assumed to be a Soviet-era relic, appears to have been upgraded closer to modern Russian standards, even though its standing force remains modest at around 20,000 ground troops, backed by a mobilization system that could multiply that number quickly, with planning circles reportedly treating the August 2024 Kursk incursion as the template for how Russia and Belarus would respond to any comparable push toward Minsk, all of which signals Belarus has quietly shifted from symbolic ally to an actual forward operating theater. Around the same time, European outlets ran a story, originating with a Polish outlet under German ownership, then picked up by a hawkish tabloid and a British broadsheet under the same corporate umbrella, claiming American intelligence had privately warned Poland's president of a coming Russian provocation involving drones, missiles, or possibly a ground element, a claim that deserves scrutiny because it traces back to unnamed figures close to the Polish president rather than to American officials directly, which is backwards from how a genuine U.S. intelligence warning would typically surface, and because days earlier the Russian president had told his own party Congress, in essence, that NATO states haven't launched missiles or drones from their own territory against Russia because they understand it would trigger retaliation against the launch sites. A conditional defensive statement that's easy to mistranslate through repetition into an offensive plan against Poland. And because stories shaped like this tend to appear exactly when European governments want firmer American commitment to Article 5, though a respected British defense think tank's separate finding that Russian drone incursions have been probing gaps in European air defense deserves more serious attention, tempered by the fact that at least one high-profile incursion case was reportedly walked back by local reporting as unconfirmed. Harder to dismiss is an actual naval standoff in the Baltic, where a NATO member's Coast Guard vessel approached a Russian-linked tanker, a Russian missile corvette moved in and issued a warning, and the Coast Guard ship backed off, echoing an earlier standoff involving an Estonian vessel that ended when Russian aircraft scrambled. And given that Kaliningrad and Belarus both border Poland, any serious clash in this region wouldn't stay contained, with the underlying military geography of a major naval base, substantial air power, and missile range from multiple directions still favoring Russia significantly, meaning some voices in European policy circles are underestimating what an actual clash would look look like while overestimating current deterrence. In parallel, Russian officials have converged on the message that the EU has stopped being purely an economic bloc and is becoming a military political actor in its own right, making Ukrainian accession just as unacceptable to Moscow as NATO membership, a position the Russian president himself had avoided stating outright until his spokesman recently said plainly that the EU is turning into a military, political, and economic bloc that Russia is factoring into its planning, language specific enough to reasonably reflect the president's own thinking, meaning any settlement assuming Ukraine can trade NATO membership for EU membership is likely to run into this redefinition. Separately, roughly 170,000 Russian troops are reported in the Bryansk region bordering Ukraine's Chernihiv region, a number that hasn't gotten the attention it deserves given Ukraine's top military commander has publicly tied an existing order to eventually take Kyiv to a possible advance from Bryansk into Chernihiv. Though sourcing close to the buildup suggests the more immediate goal is consolidation rather than an imminent push. Still, a force that size, larger than what Russia committed to the initial push on Kyiv at the war's start, doesn't sit still forever, and when it moves, even toward a limited objective, the psychological shock in Kyiv and European capitals will likely be severe. On the front line, the recent trend has been acceleration rather than slowdown, with slow mop-up operations continuing around Lyman and Kostiantynivka following Russian captures, and forces reportedly pushing close enough to fortified positions east of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk that ground troops have filmed the Sloviansk thermal plant visible on the horizon. Proximity, not capture, but a marker of how close the fighting has crept. While in the air, a heavy combined drone and missile strike on Kyiv was followed by a Ukrainian counterstrike of several hundred drones mostly intercepted, and a separate, reportedly more damaging set of strikes hit Crimea, though the claim that this makes Crimea a strategic burden for Russia doesn't hold up if you apply the same logic to Kyiv, which absorbs far heavier strikes without anyone calling it unsustainable for Ukraine. Underneath all of this sits a growing sense that the United States is quietly stepping back from its traditional role as Europe's security guarantor, with the American president repeatedly questioning the fairness of unconditionally defending NATO allies who were, in his telling, notably missing when Washington needed support during its recent standoff with Iran, a position likely more pressure tactic, aimed at getting Europe to buy more of its own weapons, largely from American manufacturers, than a genuine plan to abandon the alliance, though many observers underestimate how unsettling that rhetoric is to planners who spent years antagonizing Russia diplomatically, backing an open-ended war in Ukraine that privately isn't going well, and building a defense industrial base and standing militaries not currently positioned to win a conventional war against a larger, more battle-tested Russian force. All on the assumption that America would show up if things got serious, and an assumption now being openly questioned at the same moment a recent US-Iran confrontation has, in many outside observers' eyes, exposed the limits of American power, producing something close to real fear in European capitals that tends to generate overreaction rather than careful policy, sometimes toward appeasement, but just as often toward escalation, on the logic that it's better to force a confrontation now, while some American backing still exists. One more thread running underneath the military headlines. The legal dispute over frozen Russian central bank assets is heating up, with a Moscow arbitration court ruling in Russia's favor against the European institution holding those funds, prompting that institution to reportedly file a countersuit in Belgian courts to preempt enforcement, a fight whose details remain unclear, but whose broader signal is that European institutions are treating the Russian legal threat seriously enough to defend themselves in multiple jurisdictions at once. A fight likely to run alongside the military and diplomatic tracks for a long while. Put together, the outreach to Iran, the private military arrangement behind the Minsk letter, Belarus's upgraded army, a provocation narrative that looks more like an attempt to re-anchor American commitment than a genuine warning, a real naval standoff in the Baltic, 170,000 troops on an uncrossed border, and a growing, largely reasonable fear in Europe that the American security guarantee its whole strategy was built on may not hold. None of this guarantees a wider war, but it does show the current trajectory of more deployments, more leaks, more naval standoffs, and essentially no real diplomatic contact isn't stable. And situations like this usually resolve either through genuine negotiation, nobody currently seems willing to start, or through an incident that forces the issue. The rational response would be serious diplomacy on both sides, but that needs someone willing to sit at the table. And right now, European governments, unlike the Ukrainians and Americans who at least maintain some contact with Moscow, are showing no real appetite for that. And while a negotiated path would be far preferable, it's not clear that's the direction things are heading.